Sergeant Harker walked the column from rear to front before we stepped off. He checked sling tension. I've carried a lot of things back from the war. A bad knee, a few photographs creased at the edges, the smell of damp wool in my memory whenever it rains. But what stayed heaviest wasn't a wound or a picture. It was a name. Sergeant William Bill Harker. Most men remembered him as the man who cost us Hill 92. I remember him as the man who saved every one of us who came off that hill alive. My name is Corporal James Carter, 1st Infantry Division. A rifleman in the autumn push of 1944, somewhere along the German border when the leaves were already falling faster than the shells. I was 22, a black kid from Detroit who'd thought joining the army would buy me respect. Instead, I learned respect was rationed out just like everything else, sparingly, and mostly to men who looked different than me. Harker was one of those rare white sergeants who didn't waste time on skin color. He was a tall, broad-shouldered Pennsylvanian with a voice like gravel sliding in a bucket. His way of leading was simple. You did your job. He had your back. Didn't matter where you were from. Didn't matter what the other platoons whispered. Under Harker, I felt like I was carrying the same rifle as everybody else, not carrying the weight of proving I belonged. We'd been ordered to seize Hill 92, a bald rise overlooking a crossroads where two German supply routes met. Intel swore the hill was lightly held, a few machine gun nests and mortars at best. They were wrong. When we started up the slope at first light, the fog was thick enough to hide a church steeple at 10 paces. Halfway up, the hill came alive, MG-42s ripping the mist to ribbons, mortar rounds coughing from behind log bunkers. Men went down so fast the squad didn't even have time to curse. Harker kept us moving. He didn't shout. He roared, voice cutting through the chaos. Spread out. Keep your intervals. Keep climbing. Every time someone froze, he was there shoving or dragging them forward. By mid-morning, we'd clawed our way to a shell-chewed trench halfway up the slope. That's where we learned the second bad surprise. The hill's slope hit a full German company dug in with interlocked fire. The trench we huddled in wasn't cover. It was a shooting gallery. I remember lying there, mud soaking through my field jacket, heart slamming so loud I could barely hear the gunfire, and seeing Harker stand up long enough to throw a smoke grenade uphill. It blossomed a thick white cloud that bought us 30 seconds to pull our wounded back and crawl deeper into the trench line. 30 seconds. Men lived because of that half minute. We held there for hours, pinned. Ammo dwindled, water ran out. The fog burned off until the sun baked the mud into stiff clay. Every time one of us tried to shift position, a German gunner would stitch the dirt inches from our helmets. At some point near dusk, command crackled over the SCR-300 that we were to hold at all costs until a flanking unit could reach us by nightfall. But there was no sign of that flank, and Harker knew the hill would eat us alive if we stayed put. He started crawling the trench, whispering, "Get your gear ready. We're falling back after dark." Quiet as ghosts. Not one of us argued. We wanted off that hill almost as bad as we wanted to live. Just before sunset, a shell landed close enough to cave in part of the trench wall. The blast half-buried 2 men. We dug them out with bleeding hands. The rest of the evening passed in that strange battlefield half-light. Orange sky over churned brown earth. The smell of cordite and pine needles and fear. When full dark finally came, the hill went quiet except for the crackle of distant gunfire farther east. That's when Harker gave the order. Pack it. We move now. Slow and low. I remember thinking as I tightened my chin strap that if we made it back to our lines, it would be because one man had decided enough was enough. I didn't know then that that same decision would cost him his stripes, his reputation, and everything he thought he was fighting for. They sent us back out the very next night. Same grid, same ridgeline, different orders. We were to verify a suspected ammo dump tucked somewhere along a dry creek bed that twisted like a broken spine through the hills. Command said the timing was critical. Command always said that when the maps were guesswork. Sergeant Harker walked the column from rear to front before we stepped off. He checked sling tension. He checked safeties. He checked eyes. When he stopped at me, he tapped my magazine twice with a gloved knuckle. "Fresh," he said. "Fresh," I answered. He moved on. That was Harker. No speeches, just the ritual that kept your brain from drifting into the dark. We left the wire at last light, moving single file down a cattle track worn into the hillside. The air carried the smell of dust and some wildflower I did not know by name. The moon was late. The world belonged to sound, gear creak, boot scuff, a distant dog barking from a village we could not see. Half a mile out, Mullins took point. He was jumpy at the best of times. Tonight the jump lived on his shoulders. He kept glancing back for approval he was never going to get. Harker let him ride it out. I walked third. Behind me, Deloach and Ortiz shared a radio that loved to fade when you needed it and scream when you did not. Somewhere in the middle, Lieutenant Parson drifted like fog. You could feel his rank more than you could see his shape. We all knew he was new to the field. He wore the shine like a smell. At the creek bed, we hunkered down. Dry stones shifted under our knees with tiny clicks that sounded huge in the hush. Mullins pointed to a notch in the bank, the print of a boot heel. Half moon. Deep. Recent, he whispered. Harker nodded. He raised 2 fingers. The squad fanned to cover arcs. I slid to a low elbow rest and tasted iron on my tongue. Fear is a metal. It carries through your teeth. We waited. Silence stacked on silence. The longer it stretched, the more your thoughts tried to invent shapes where there were none. A bush became a crouch. A rock became a helmet. I kept my breathing small. Then the radio coughed. A hard pop of static. Lieutenant Parson flinched. Deloach winced and dialed the gain low. Parson cleared his throat like he wanted to make a decision sound official. We push, he whispered. 2 fire teams. Leapfrog. We need eyes on that dump. Harker leaned over his shoulder. His voice stayed level. Sir, we hold 30 and listen. If they are staging, we will hear them. If we push blind, we silhouette on that shelf and eat fire. Parson's jaw set. Maybe pride, maybe nerves. He looked at me and then at Mullins. He wanted motion. Motion felt like leadership. We push, he repeated. Harker did not sigh. He did not argue. He tapped my boot and Mullins' heel. Short bounds, he said. Keep it tight. If it smells wrong, it is wrong. We moved. 10 yards, knees, 10 more, palms on cold stone. I could feel the creek bed breathing, the way night places do. Mullins reached the shelf and went flat. I slid up beside him, shoulder to shoulder. The earth cooled my cheek. Ahead, the creek cut left out of sight. Faint light pulsed on the bend like someone cupping a match. Mullins looked at me. I shook my head. We waited. The light pulsed again. Not a match. A covered lamp. Someone testing a hood. I whispered into the hand mic. Coleman. Light at the left bend. Low. Intermittent. Harker's reply came like a thread. Copy, hold, counting 30. Behind us, Parson shifted. The radio cracked again. A louder pop. The kind that travels. From the bend, a voice barked once. Not English. Then the creek exploded into sound. The first burst stitched the shelf a foot above our heads. Grit peppered my neck. Mullins jerked, then clamped down like he could force his own nerves to obey. Harker's voice cut across the chaos without shouting. Smoke front, 2 cans. Left flank, peel. Right, anchor. Rodriguez popped smoke like he was born doing it. White rolled off the shelf and filled the bend with a wet cloud. I pressed the trigger and sent 2 measured pairs at the muzzle flash. Quiet on the third. I swapped mags by touch. Back 2, Harker called. Coleman, hold for last. We peeled. Deloach and Ortiz slid past with the radio. Mullins stuttered, then moved. I held the angle. A figure broke through the smoke close enough that I saw the whites of his eyes before his rifle came up. I beat him to it. The barrel flash burned a comet after image in my vision. My hands shook once and then found stillness. We fell back 20 yards to the low rise. Harker put us into a shallow V that faced the bend and the shelf at once. The incoming fire flattened as our smoke did its work. Through the radio hiss, Parsons' voice sounded thin. We need to push, he said. We will lose them. Harker knelt next to him. His tone did not harden. It cooled. Sir, we hold. They planned that shelf. If we chase, we run into a box. Parsons stared at him. And in the dark, I could feel the choice hanging between them. Rank on one side, experience on the other. The men watched without turning their heads. The radio snapped again, and this time another voice cut in from the rear CP. Actual. Confirm advance. Parsons' hand hovered over the mic. Harker did not touch him. He just said, quiet enough for only us to hear, "If you want us home, say hold." The smoke thinned. The firing died to a few angry shots. The lamp at the bend went dark like a wink. Parson lowered the mic. "Hold," he said. Harker nodded once and started counting sectors. He did not look satisfied. He looked like a man who had just bought us 5 more minutes to live and was already looking for the next 5. I lay there in the grit, lungs burning, and realized something simple. Leadership did not have to be loud, and I also realized something else. When the blame came, and it always came for somebody, Harker would square his shoulders and take it if it meant the rest of us kept our feet. By the second night on Hill 87, the rain hadn't let up. It came down thin and needling. Not enough to wash the mud off your boots, but just enough to keep everything soaked. The sandbags sagged like wet bread. The trench smelled of wet wool, spent powder, and something sour we didn't name. Sergeant Elijah Cole's voice was hoarse from shouting over gunfire the previous evening. Even hoarse, it carried authority, low, deliberate, and the kind that made you look up whether you liked him or not. He walked the line, checking every foxhole. His poncho draped over squared shoulders, rain sliding down into his collar. Some of the younger white privates stiffened when he passed. I saw it, the way they lowered their eyes a fraction too late, as if they'd been caught judging the man instead of the rank. Cole ignored it. He always ignored it, but that didn't mean he didn't feel it. That was something I'd learned about him in the weeks before Hill 87. He carried the disrespect like another ammo pouch. Silent, heavy, necessary to keep his hands free for the fight. Corporal Rizzo muttered to me while we cleaned our M1s under a poncho tent. "Whole platoon's leaning on Cole like he's made of iron. If he ever lets it slip that he's tired, the rest of us are done." I didn't argue. After midnight, the rain slackened to a drizzle and the fog rolled in, thick as steam off a kettle. Our forward listening post reported movement below the slope. Cole ordered 2 flares loaded but held fire. "Could be a probe," he said. "Could be civilians running the ridgeline. We don't waste rounds till we're sure." We waited like that nearly an hour. Backs cramped, fingers numb around cold steel. Listening to the fog breathe. When the enemy finally came, they came quiet. 3 shadows climbing through the brush, no helmets, long knives in their teeth like something out of a nightmare. The first flare hissed up, throwing orange on rain-slick leaves. Cole didn't even raise his voice, just said, "Take them." 3 short bursts of Garand fire ended the probe before they reached our wire. The flare drifted down on a little red silk parachute, hissing as it died in the wet grass. Cole crouched beside the bodies for a moment, checking pockets for maps. He came back with nothing but a length of black fuse cord. "Sabotage team," he said. "They were hunting our ammo dump. By dawn, command radioed new orders. The company to our right had been chewed up. Hill 87's flank was exposed. We were to hold our sector, and theirs, till relief came at nightfall." Everybody heard the part that wasn't said. If we lost the hill, we'd be blamed for the whole line buckling. Cole gathered us near the command bunker. The rain had stopped, but the sky still pressed low and gray. He rested one boot on an ammo crate and spoke like he was passing judgment in a courtroom. "We don't have numbers. We don't have clean rifles. What we have is this hill and each other. Keep your sectors tight. Watch your buddies flank. Nobody plays hero unless it buys the rest of us another minute alive." Some of the men nodded. Some looked at their boots. Nobody cheered. This wasn't the sort of speech that made you feel brave, just steady. That afternoon, the ridgeline stayed quiet. Too quiet. We heard distant shelling toward the valley, but nothing up close, and that worried Cole more than bullets. "Means they're staging," he muttered to me while we fixed sandbags. "When they come, it'll be all at once." Close to dusk, a runner from battalion arrived, soaked to the bone, carrying a field map in a waterproof sleeve. Cole studied it under the last scrap of daylight and frowned hard enough for the scar on his temple to twist white. The map showed our flank line already marked in red as probable loss. They'd written us off before the fight even started. Cole folded the map without a word, but the look in his eyes said everything. No matter how the night went, the brass already had someone to blame. When darkness swallowed the hill again, we heard the first distant bugle echo from the valley. a sound old as war itself. Cole adjusted his web gear, checked the 45 on his hip, then moved down the trench, touching shoulders as he passed. To each man he said only one word: steady. When he reached me, he paused long enough to meet my eyes. Rain-streaked, tired but steady. "Coleman," he said, "keep that Browning low and swing with the wire. Don't let anybody through it alive." I nodded. The bugle sounded again, closer, longer, and somewhere downslope in the dark we couldn't see through, we heard men shouting in a language we didn't understand. Cole raised one hand. Every rifle barrel lifted with it. We waited for the hill to catch fire. The first burst of fire came just as the last trace of daylight slid off the ridge. A machine gun from somewhere below stitched the lower wire with sparks. Every man on the trench wall flinched but held position. Cole stood at the center of the line, a dark silhouette against the pale sky. "Hold your fire till you see muzzle flash," he ordered. His voice stayed calm, not loud, just sharp enough to cut through the panic starting to rise in our throats. The enemy tried to rush in low, hoping to reach the wire before we could adjust. The first flare went up on Cole's signal, bursting white and hissing down on a tiny parachute. The jungle hillside lit like midday, and for a heartbeat we saw them all. Crouched shapes, helmets wet with rain, rifles raised. I opened up with the Browning the way he'd told me, low and swinging with the wire. The gun kicked and clattered against its tripod as I dragged the stream of tracers left to right. Men went down in the sudden light. Others dove behind roots and logs. Rodriguez and Rizzo fired Garans over my bursts, picking off the ones who tried to crawl closer. The flare drifted out and the world dropped back into darkness, but the screaming and the splashing didn't stop. More flares popped. More bursts of gunfire raked the slope. The smell of wet earth turned sharp with powder and hot brass. Cole moved along the line, crouched low, tapping helmets with his hand as he passed, checking ammo pouches, shifting men where gaps opened. Once he stopped at my shoulder. "Good swing, Coleman. Keep it waist high. Don't waste rounds on trees." It wasn't praise, it was instruction, but it steadied me all the same. The first wave broke against the wire and slid back into the dark, leaving shapes tangled on the stakes. We'd held, but not cleanly. Private Hanley lay face down in the mud. His helmet rolled a few feet away. Rodriguez dragged him back by the collar and swore under his breath when he saw the wound. Price crawled over to press a field dressing into the side of Hanley's neck, his own hands shaking so hard he could barely tear the tape. The radio hissed once, then went dead again. Preacher banged the set with his palm, trying to raise battalion, but nothing answered. Cole crouched beside him long enough to say, "Forget HQ. We fight what's in front of us." Around midnight the firing eased. Only the rain and the low groan of the wounded broke the silence. Cole let us rotate watches, 2 men at a time, while the rest tried for a few minutes of shut-eye in water-logged foxholes. I stayed awake, cleaning the Browning's barrel with a piece of oil-soaked rag, watching the wire through the curtain of mist. Somewhere down the trench, Rizzo whispered, "They'll come again. Bet they're just pulling their dead back." Nobody answered him. Even whispering felt like tempting the next attack. An hour later, the jungle answered anyway. A mortar thumped from the valley floor, then another. The first shell landed wide. The second dropped short, but close enough to shower us with dirt and splinters. Cole called out the ranges as calmly as if he were running a drill. "Stay spread. Low in the trench. Coleman, keep that gun ready. When the barrage lifts, they'll charge again." The barrage lasted 10 minutes. A slow, methodical pounding that shook the ridge but didn't cave it. When the last echo rolled away, we heard the bugle once more. Nearer now, harsher, almost ragged with urgency. Cole rose to one knee, helmet tilted forward to shield his eyes from flare light. He looked down the trench and said, "Second wave. They're coming angry. Hold fast." The next flare lit the slope to find dozens of dark figures breaking from the brush at a run, shouting as they came. The Browning roared before the flare even reached full bloom. I tracked the front edge of the rush, cutting swaths across the mud. Rodriguez's rifle cracked beside me and measured rhythm. Price fired too high and Cole snapped at him to lower his sight picture. For a few minutes there was no rain, no night, no thought. Just light, thunder, smoke, and the clatter of the belt sliding through my hands. The wire held again but bent in 3 places. A few of the enemy actually reached it before falling tangled and still. When it was over, we could hear the survivors dragging their wounded back into the brush, their voices thin and bitter on the night air. Cole gave the order to reset the flares and redistribute what ammo we had left. While we worked, he stopped near Hanley's covered body, rested his palm for a moment on the poncho draped over the kid's chest, then moved on without a word. That was the first time I realized he carried every loss like a stone in his pocket, silent but never forgotten. We knew they'd come again before dawn. We also knew the hill wouldn't last another full assault. And still, Cole's voice when he made the rounds was steady as before. "Stay sharp. We're still in the fight. Nobody quits this line." I didn't know then that, by sunrise, Command would be looking for someone to blame for the casualties. And Cole, Sergeant Elijah Cole, was already preparing to make sure it wouldn't be any of us. We waited for the third attack like men sitting on a fault line, certain the ground would split again at any second. The ridge smelled of burned powder and wet canvas. A thin fog dragged across the wire as if the hill itself was trying to hide what had happened. Rodriguez sat on an ammo crate with his helmet tilted back, eyes half closed but still awake. Rizzo worked a fresh belt into the Browning, humming under his breath like he did when nerves threatened to shake him apart. I cleaned the feed tray with a strip of cloth that used to be white before the night turned it gray. Cole paced the line like he was counting each man under his breath. He stopped beside me. "You did good last night, Coleman," he said quietly, almost like he didn't want the others to hear. "You kept that gun steady. That's the difference between us standing and us buried." I only nodded. Praise from Cole was rare, meant to be absorbed, not answered. Near dawn, we got our first look at what the hill had cost. The mist cleared enough to show bodies caught on the wire, dark shapes hunched like broken scarecrows. A few enemy helmets bobbed in the ravine below. No one spoke. Price muttered a prayer, and even Doyle, who usually had something sharp to say on Motet, just looked away. At first light, a runner made it up from battalion headquarters, splattered with mud and breathing hard. He brought orders that turned every head. A relief column was supposed to reach us by noon. We just had to hold the ridge until then. If the route stayed clear, we could finally rotate out. Cole didn't celebrate. "If the route stays clear," he repeated flatly. "That's 2 ifs too many." By mid-morning, the drizzle started again, turning the trench floor into a brown soup that sucked at our boots. The damp made every scrape of metal louder. I watched Cole pull his jacket tighter around his shoulders, but his eyes never left the tree line below. Around 10, the radio crackled back to life long enough for us to catch half a message. Enemy artillery reported repositioning across the valley, possibly sighting the ridge. Then the signal died again, swallowed by static. Cole's jaw tightened. "They'll soften us up first," he said. "Gunners don't like to waste their charge if they think we'll break before the shells land." We spent the next hour reinforcing the trench with more sandbags, anything to give us another inch of cover. Doyle grumbled but followed Cole's lead. Whatever grudges he still held about rank or race, even. He couldn't deny that Cole had kept the hill standing so far. The first shells came just after noon. A high-pitched whistle, then the crack of dirt and rock erupting in the rear slope. Another hit the edge of the trench, spraying us with gravel and splinters. We ducked low, waiting for the next. They walked the barrage slowly across the ridge, each blast closer than the last, until the air stank of burned powder and wet clay. Cole crouched near me, one hand braced on the parapet as the earth shook. "When they lift the barrage, we'll have maybe a minute before they charge," he said calmly. "Check your barrel, Coleman. I'll need you to keep that lane closed." The barrage lifted as suddenly as it started. The silence afterward was worse than the explosions. We all knew what came next. Then we heard them. Not the bugle this time, but low, rough chanting rolling up the slope. The sound carried through the mist like the river rumbling below. The third wave came in tighter formation, using the dead ground left by the craters for cover. Our first volley tore into them but didn't stop the rush. They hit the wire harder than before, some throwing themselves on it to drag it down while the rest pushed through the gap. Rodriguez yelled that they'd made it to the lower trench. Cole left his position and moved to the breach, Thompson at his hip, firing in short bursts. His shouts cut through the chaos clear and steady. "Hold the line! Don't give an inch!" I swung the Browning toward the breach and opened fire until the barrel smoked again, cutting a path just in front of the wire where the ground dipped. The enemy faltered, then broke, leaving the slope littered with packs and helmets. When the last shots faded, my hands were shaking from the recoil and the cold. We'd held the ridge, but the trench smelled of blood and cordite. 2 more of our men were down, one of them barely breathing. Cole came back along the line, his face streaked with mud and rain, his eyes scanning for anyone still able to fight. "No one falls asleep on me," he said. "We're still here. We hold until relief arrives, no matter what it costs." That was the moment I began to realize what he meant about cost. It wasn't just bodies or bullets. It was the burden he carried for every name that wouldn't be on the roster tomorrow. And none of us knew yet that command would look at all that blood and decide it had to be someone's fault. Relief didn't come at noon. It didn't come at all that day. The radio sputtered in mid-afternoon with a broken apology. The convoy had been delayed by fresh shelling farther down the valley. They'd try again in the morning, if the road stayed open. We were on our own another night. Cole took the news with a slight nod, as if he'd expected nothing better. "Then we hold another night," he said. The men groaned, but no one argued. They were too tired even for complaints. Rodriguez taped his split knuckles with a strip of bandage. Doyle cleaned his rifle in silence, the first time all day he'd sat down. The rain returned at dusk, heavier than before, sliding down our helmets in cold sheets and turning the trench into a shallow canal. We huddled under ponchos, sharing what little dry rations were left, chewing in silence as the ridge disappeared into another fog-shrouded night. Cole walked the line again, pausing at each fighting position to crouch beside the men. He didn't waste words. A pat on the shoulder here, a short nod there. When he came to me, he leaned close so only I could hear. "They're going to blame somebody for this hill when it's done," he said quietly. "You hear me, Coleman? Whatever happens tonight, you keep your head down and your mouth shut." I frowned. Not sure I understood, but before I could ask, he moved on. Around midnight, we caught the smell of smoke that wasn't ours, sharp and acrid, drifting on the wind. Rodriguez whispered, "They're burning something down there." Cole raised a hand for silence. Through the mist, we heard faint clinks of metal on stone. Enemy sappers were probing again, maybe setting up another charge in the lower trench. Cole tapped my shoulder. "Coleman, you and Doyle check the lower slope. Quiet." We moved out together, crouching low along the sandbag wall until we reached the spot near the wire where the smell was strongest. The fog was thick enough to taste, beating on my eyelashes. Doyle's breathing was ragged, too loud, but he didn't complain. A sudden flare went up downstream, enemy launched, and for an instant the ridge lit like daylight. I caught sight of 2 figures crouched at the base of the wire, working fast with something metallic. "Tripwire charge," Doyle hissed. I didn't wait for orders. My rifle barked twice. Doyle added 3 more shots, and both figures went down. The flare burned out, throwing us back into darkness, but the night had heard us. Voices rose from the valley below, followed by a scattered burst of rifle fire that clipped the sandbags inches above our heads. We scrambled back to the main trench as return fire from Rodriguez and Rizzo laced the slope. The skirmish was short, more harassment than assault, but it left us rattled and wetter than before. When it quieted, Doyle rounded on me. "You always shoot first, Coleman?" he snapped. I wiped rain from my eyes. "If I hadn't, that wire would be gone. You know it." For a heartbeat, he looked ready to argue, then shut his mouth and stomped away. Cole said nothing. He only glanced at me and gave the faintest nod. The rest of the night dragged like wet canvas. Every gust of wind sounded like boots in the grass. We fired at shadows more than once and cursed ourselves afterward. Near dawn, the rain eased, but the fog stayed thick, creeping across the slope like a living thing. The ridge smelled of mud and gun oil. My shoulders ached from bracing the Browning all night. Cole gathered us for a short briefing. "We hold until the relief shows up. If they don't come by noon, we rotate 2 men at a time for rest, but we do not, repeat, do not abandon the ridge. This hill is ours until command says otherwise." His voice was hoarse but steady. The men listened. Even Doyle didn't interrupt. I remember thinking then that Cole carried more than the weight of the ridge. He carried every man's fear with him, packing it down behind that gravel voice. I didn't know yet how far he'd go to shield us from more than enemy fire. By the time the sun pushed a thin, pale line over the fog, we'd survived another night. But none of us. The relief convoy never came at noon. Instead, we got new orders crackling through the radio, distorted by static and bad weather. Enemy armor had been spotted on the road north of our ridge. We were to hold position and expect renewed assault before nightfall. Cole didn't flinch. "Same orders," he said. "We hold." The men shifted uneasily. Doyle spat into the mud. "Command thinks we can hold this ridge with rifles against armor?" Cole's reply was dry. "We don't have to stop the tanks, we just have to hold until they never get here." We spent the afternoon fortifying what we could. Rodriguez and I reinforced the center trench with more sandbags. Kenny Price checked the mortar rounds again, even though we only had 6 left. Every man's face was drawn and gray from sleeplessness. Around 3, the fog began to lift in patches, revealing black scars on the far slope where artillery shells had hit during the night. It was a grim view, but at least we could see again. We spotted movement. Enemy patrols sweeping the lower ravine, probably assessing our lines. Cole ordered us to keep our fire. No need to start the party until they show their invites. By sunset, the sky turned the color of rusted iron. The wind shifted and brought the smell of burning wood from some distant village. We ate what was left of our cold rations in silence. That's when Doyle pulled me aside. His voice was low, rough. "Cole's going to get himself killed babysitting us. You see how he steps in every time command calls for volunteers?" I shrugged. "He's the sergeant. That's his job." Doyle shook his head. "No, that's his guilt. I think he's been carrying something we don't know about." Before I could ask what he meant, the ridge erupted. It started with a shriek of incoming rounds, mortars again, followed by the crack of rifles as enemy troops pushed up the slope in waves. We dove into position, answering fire for fire. Dirt rained on us from near misses. Rodriguez cursed as a fragment clipped his helmet. Price kept feeding me ammo for the Browning, his hands trembling but steady enough to keep the belts moving. In the middle of the chaos, Cole was everywhere at once, moving between foxholes, barking directions, hauling the wounded back behind the second trench. At one point, he ripped a grenade from a dead man's vest and pitched it downslope with a shout that drowned even the gunfire. I remember him vaulting a sandbag wall to drag a bleeding soldier back by the collar, bullets snapping past. His boots. His voice was raw but still calm, like he'd decided that fear was a luxury none of us could afford. The assault lasted nearly 40 minutes before breaking off, leaving 3 of our men wounded and the ground below the ridge littered with enemy dead. The trench smelled of blood and wet sand. My ears rang so bad I couldn't hear Doyle when he spoke. I only saw his mouth moving. When the noise faded enough to think, I found Cole sitting against a sandbag wall, catching his breath. His helmet was gone, his hair plastered to his head with sweat and rain, his sleeve torn at the elbow where a bullet had grazed him. I dropped beside him and said, "You saved Lutz. You know that, right?" He gave a faint half-smile. "Just another day's work." But his eyes didn't smile. They looked like someone staring at a ledger he couldn't balance. Before dawn, we got another transmission from command. Orders that would change everything. They wanted a report on the night's losses and an explanation for the damaged supply route. Cole listened in silence, then signed off with a clipped, "Yes, sir." He didn't tell us what was said. Not yet. But I saw the set of his jaw as he looked out over the ridge and knew the weight was settling on him again. The ridge was quiet for the rest of the night, but none of us slept. Dawn broke pale and brittle over the ridge. The fog in the valley thinned just enough for us to see the churned-up earth where last night's attack had died. The birds came back, timid at first, then louder, as if they didn't care that the ground was still stained with blood. Cole stood near the field phone, helmet tucked under one arm, speaking in a low voice to command. We couldn't hear the words, only the clipped, "Yes, sir," understood. When he hung up, he stayed there a moment longer, staring at the handset as if it might speak again. Finally, he turned to us. "Command needs a scapegoat for the broken convoy line," he said. "They say our sector failed to report the flank route in time. I was in charge, so it's on me." Rodriguez frowned. "That's a lie. The maps were wrong. We all saw it." Cole gave a weary shrug. "The brass doesn't care. Somebody has to carry it. Better me than any of you." I stepped forward. "Sarge, we can all back your report. They can't pin this on you alone." His eyes found mine. "Coleman, in their eyes, my word's already half-priced. You know that. I'll sign what they need. You boys go home clean." For a second, no one spoke. Even Doyle, who had always kept a wall between himself and Cole, opened his mouth as if to argue, then closed it again. Whatever pride or bitterness he carried, it wasn't enough to fight the decision. That afternoon, the relief trucks finally reached us. We loaded the wounded first, then our own battered gear. Before we rolled out, Cole stayed behind to hand the ridge over to the next unit. I watched him shake hands with their officer, formal, stiff, like two men passing an invisible burden from one to the other. On the ride back to base, the men were mostly silent. The wind tasted of dust and cordite. Doyle finally spoke up, his voice rough. "Sergeant Cole didn't have to do that," he muttered. "But he did." Rodriguez added quietly, "Man deserved better than to take the blame for all of us." I stared out at the hills sliding by and said nothing. Some debts can't be repaid with words. We never saw Cole again after that debriefing. Last I heard, he was reassigned. Paperwork full of reprimands that didn't belong to him. But I remember the ridge the way it really happened. The night he held the line. The morning he carried the weight so the rest of us wouldn't have to. Men like that don't get monuments. They get memories. And this story, his story, is mine to keep alive. If you've stayed with me through every minute of this, honor Sergeant Cole's memory. Hit subscribe so these voices of the past don't fade, and share this story so the man who took the fall for us all is never forgotten.